It was on the 30th of January 1946 that a number of high-ranking members of the German army, the Wehrmacht, were dragged out to a public square within the city of Minsk, which had been terrorised during World War II. These men were taken up to a huge set of gallows which had been created, and roughly around 100,000 people clambered for a good view to see the executions of the men whom they believed had persecuted them and slaughtered many of their friends, family members and neighbours during the war. Some of those who were executed were rather senior in the army, and one of these condemned officers was Johann Georg Richert, a German general who was known for his brutal actions and war crimes. But on the gallows in front of a large crowd, he was condemned for his crimes, and the life was choked out of him. Today we look at the public execution of the German general hanged for war crimes. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 14th of April 1890, Johann Georg Richert was born, and as a young man he dreamed of a career inside of the armed forces. He managed to achieve this, and he rose throughout the German military and army during many years. To begin with, his army service started in 1909, and then through different promotions he rose throughout the ranks. Specifically, he fought during the First World War, which gripped Europe 5 years after he began his military career, and over the course of 3 decades, Richert would rise to the rank of a general. He got to this achievement during the Second World War, and during the conflict, Hitler wanted many of his forces to be commanded by senior soldiers who had a huge amount of experience. A lot of his forces were not the most battle-hardened to begin with, and needed to be guided by generals who had seen all different kinds of combat and fighting over a long period of time. Richert was given command of different divisions, and specifically he was known for being a brutal war criminal, and his men carried out many atrocities. He gave an order that all of his own soldiers who were in hospital without a physical injury or illness, and who were suffering with mental struggles such as shell shock or PTSD, should be executed. He was a ruthless man, and he wanted his men to follow his lead. He saw forces trying to flee the battlefield as the ultimate disgrace, and he ordered many of his own soldiers to be shot by makeshift firing squads made up of their friends and fellow officers. Those who had eaten their dinners with soldiers days before in the mess hall were then shooting them upon the orders of Richert. He also said that any forces under his command who lost battles and who would retreat to fight another day would also be punished and shot. With this you can really see what sort of a general Richert was, and he dealt with prisoners of war terribly too. Specifically, he commanded the 286th Security Division on the Eastern Front, and they were based in the Soviet Union following Operation Barbarossa. His men were attached to the Fourth Army and were to seize control of security duties in the regions after the advances of the German army, and they terrorised local people. They ordered thousands to be deported and transported to extermination centres, where they were killed within minutes of arriving. And they sometimes didn't even allow this to happen, and they ordered people to dig their own graves, and then ordered them to lie down before shooting them themselves, carrying out similar massacres like the Einsatzgruppen would. Inside of Belarus during the Second World War, roughly 25% of the population were exterminated by the Nazis, and the security division led by General Richert carried out many atrocities against the people of the land. He also commanded the 25th Infantry Division, and continued as the war years rolled on to conduct war crimes. His soldiers were ordered to take brutal action against civilians and also partisan resistors, and they took part in anti-partisan raids and operations in the region of Gomel in Belarus. There were roughly 40,000 people who were thrown out of their homes, and they were ordered out as the German army were at this point in the conflict in retreat. In this there were 9,000 civilians who died, and many were expelled to death camps, makeshift sites of slaughter where thousands of people were locked up, being guarded by men such as Richert. One of the camps, Ozarichi, was liberated by the Soviets, and they discovered thousands of corpses, and they managed to free over 30,000 people, and this included 15,000 children, who had been rounded up by General Richert's forces. However, as the Second World War continued to go badly for the Germans, Richert was seized and arrested as the conflict did come to an end, resulting in German defeat. He was seized by the Soviets in May 1945. General Richert would have taken immense shame from the fact he was captured, and fell into the hands of his enemies. But inside of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin wanted to show his population what he did to war criminals who had terrorized his people. With this, he ordered a number of trials and then public executions, where people could see that vengeance and justice was being enacted. The German generals and commanders were dealt with very harshly, and many were sent to gulags where they died, but some were spared this, like Richert, who was brought to trial. Within key cities such as Leningrad, there were huge public executions of German war criminals on specially built large gallows. In 1946, Johann Georg Richert was brought out to a court proceeding in Minsk. He was tried by a Soviet military court and was charged with being a leader of large-scale deportations and being involved in the slaughter of Soviet civilians. He was also accused of burning villages to the ground. Alongside him was another general, Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf, and there were 18 defendants in total, all men who had been captured and who were accused of crimes against humanity in Belarus and the surrounding regions. The court trial was a formality, and it was obvious what would happen to General Richert. He was sentenced to death, and the court heard of his crimes. However, it was not long before his execution took place. He was executed on the very day after he was actually sentenced to death, having a mere matter of hours to come to terms with his crimes. On the 30th of January 1946, in front of around 100,000 people, who had all been gathered to witness the executions that took place in the centre of Minsk, there was a palpable feeling. Many were excited, and the crowd was made up of lots of people who had suffered a great deal during the Second World War. Lots had lost their loved ones and neighbours to the occupation, and they viewed men such as General Richert with complete contempt, and they saw him as completely evil and barbarous. This sentiment and feeling was exactly what Joseph Stalin wanted. He wanted his population to feel the anger, and that his government were listening and punishing these men in such public fashion that they felt that justice was being carried out. The huge gallows was created in the middle of a horse racing venue in Minsk, and General Johann Richert was taken up to the gallows, and he was then taken onto the platform underneath the crossbeam by the guards. The executioners were there to wait for him and his fellow condemned men, and as the noose was secured around his neck, the death sentence and a reminder of Richert's crime was read aloud to the crowd. A short speech was then made, and after this the executioner then removed the platform of which the German general was stood on, and the noose snapped tightly around his neck, and General Richert was left hanging. He struggled for air, and then his body went limp, and a few minutes later he was declared dead. Inside of the city of Minsk, 100,000 people had gathered to witness the execution of General Richert and the other condemned men who had caused a huge amount of terror and suffering inside of Belarus during World War II. He was a brutal and barbaric man who encapsulated the terror of the Eastern Front, and Richert was someone who would even execute his own forces without a moment's hesitation. He was 55 years old when he was executed on the gallows in Minsk, and he was seen as one of the worst war criminals of the Eastern Front. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.